Hello there, and welcome to episode 25 of your Bamboo Chalupa digital marketing podcast. My name is Brett Snyder. I am the president of Knucklepuck, and I'm joined by my co-host, Nate Shiver, the author of shiverweb.com.
Hello, hello.
So Nate and I are both, as regular listeners will know, Nate and I are both SEOs by trade, meaning that our primary focus when it comes to digital marketing campaigns is search engine optimization. Now, when we tell somebody that we work in SEO, 9 out of 10 times we get the same question. So how does that work? What is it that you actually do as an SEO? We can talk about the practice of SEO in the abstract, but when it comes down to it, we're largely responsible for, a seemingly countless number of priorities all smushed together to the point where the outside observer rightfully asks, what is it that you actually do? So what we want to focus on with today's podcast is, what does a day in the life of an SEO actually look like? We're constantly moving, constantly in motion, trying to figure out what the right ways to approach Google's algorithm and Bing and Yahoo as well, of course, but figuring out what causes search engines to rank websites in those top positions. We've summed this up in, kind of referring to it as organized chaos in a lot of ways. But for this episode, we want to go through specifically the approach that Nate and I take to managing our schedules and managing our projects to be able to deliver results.
Yeah, and so I'll start off with saying that a day in the life of an SEO is never boring. And actually, one of the reasons I got into the industry and then stayed in the industry is that no day is ever the same, because there's no template for the perfect day, but there is sort of a general process that I think not only me and Brett go through, but all the best SEOs go through and experience to maximize your output, your efficiency, while limiting distractions and getting things done right. So we're going to go through sort of our typical day and then share some takeaways about things that have had the highest impact on our businesses and our workday.
And the one thing to note before we get into kind of what our traditional schedule might look like is that having an SEO process or a day in the life is really predicated on the idea that you have to trust your calendar. If you block out time for something and don't stick with it, it gets difficult to create that routine and create a process that allows you to really extract insights and trends about what is being successful for your clients. That said, Nate and I want to go through how we approach our mornings, mid-morning, early afternoons, all the way down into, the checking your email after dinner portion of the evening. And I think, Nate, why don't you go ahead and start us off with how you kick off your typical day in the life of an SEO?
Yeah, so my day usually starts 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, and I reserve that for high impact but very heavy lift activities. So that is things that are very creative in nature, hard to put together, but are also going to have the highest impact on a business. So this might be doing a technical audit where I'm crawling through a site to make sure there's no technical hurdles to search engine bots. I might be doing a lot of keyword research or putting together a content strategy that's going to take a lot of, doing research, but holding the research in my mind to synthesize it into what's going to be the best and highest impact deliverable. And so I block off the first thing in my morning before I check my email, before I check social media, before I do anything to do those high impact, heavy lift activities.
So I take a similar approach to that, but I also want to introduce a phrase that I was first introduced to on a Quora thread a couple of weeks ago, and that at the very early parts of my morning, I want to make sure I eat the frog. Now, some of our listeners might be familiar with this phrase, but essentially what it means is you want to do your most distasteful task very early in the morning. That's when you have all of your energy, you're coming off, you're excited to tackle the day. And I like to prioritize the items. Obviously, these should be high impact, but the ones that I am that create the largest hurdles for me. For example, keyword research is something that, for me personally, and the way that I work, is typically more of a grind than something like a technical audit. I love diving into the technical foundation of the site and going down every rabbit hole. But with keyword research, since it does have such a such a large impact on everything else we're going to do from a SEO perspective, I have to make sure that it's done right. And it creates a lot of stress for me to make sure that we do it right. So I schedule those types of deliverables for early in the morning. I want to make sure that I can do the ones that are going to create the most issues for me personally and knock them out when my mind is fresh, when I have, all of the mental energy that I've just got from a good night's sleep, and make sure that I can knock that out and then tackle the rest of our items after that has been completed.
After I take care of my high impact activity, so moving into mid morning, like 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, this is when I'll try to do calls or client meeting, something that requires energy but needs to be taken care of sort of earlier in the day. And I'll also reserve this time for checking email, doing research, and doing punch lists or delegating items to sort of keep all the plates spinning, removing a lot of hurdles for other people.
And the mid-morning is another one of those kind of high impact areas for me as well. We always want to, I talked about eating the frog first and foremost, get the biggest, the most stressful aspect out right away. And then from there, I'll typically go and I'll check my analytics, specifically if I have any alerts set up and I want to investigate what triggered those alerts. I will queue up some social media posts that might push out later in the day. I also like to use this time to send outreach emails for link prospects, especially those on the East Coast, because this allows you to get your communications into those prospects' inbox early in their day, take advantage of the fact that they also have, a renewed mental energy and focus at the beginning of their day. During this kind of mid-morning, and once I do all those little checks after I've eaten the frog, I use the mid-morning as another high-impact sprint time for me. And what's the biggest thing that I learned that allows me to be successful is I don't check email during this time, because I know if I check email, it introduces further distractions, and it's something that I know takes me away from the core focus of taking advantage of that time. So I'll actually turn off my email, and I'll spend this time largely on research. Gives me the opportunity to take a break from having to put together a client-facing deliverable and just make sure that I can get everything that I want to address at some point over the course of a particular strategy. I want to get everything in that one bucket. And then from there, I can take some time over lunch and in the later morning and early afternoon to kind of digest on that. But it gives me, when I get into my late afternoon, it gives me kind of that bucket has already been established. The research is completed, and it's just a matter of formatting and finalizing that in a way that can effectively communicate the goals of that strategy.
Yeah, so after my mid-morning email and research and all that is done, it'll usually be lunchtime, and I usually take lunch. Sometimes I'll go out just to have a break. Sometimes I'll basically read industry news through lunch. But either way, once I get into the early afternoon, that's when I do the next high-impact sprint. So hopefully I will have gotten the email settled during lunch, and then the early afternoon I have it closed off, working on something again like a tech audit, keyword map, writing content, or doing outreach. Hopefully there won't be another meeting to interrupt this, but oftentimes this is prime time for scheduling meetings, and so they usually happen either way.
Right. And what's interesting, that you say that, Nate, is I actually prefer the early to mid-afternoon for scheduling meetings, because it gives me an opportunity to, early in the day to be able to finalize any items that I may want to discuss during that meeting. It gets my agendas out there. We're going to talk about this in a bit about, I think, we looked at our notes here. Nate had, I think, 4 or 5 times that meetings kill productivity.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to talk about how to manage meetings a little later in the day in the life of an SEO. But for me, I actually prefer to schedule since I am more client-facing in the agency role, to schedule meetings in this early afternoon time frame, because it gives us a nice break after lunch. It allows us to take advantage of the morning for actually putting together strategies and building on things, while still giving us the chance to say, hey, if there's anything I wanted to finish up or polish off before sending over to a client in advance of our meeting, I've been able to use the morning for that. Meetings are a necessary evil in a lot of ways. You have to have these regular communications, especially in my role from an agency perspective. And I imagine in most folks, whether you're agency in-house or whether you do it yourself, having meetings with the complementary team members is absolutely essential, but it's also essential that we do them the right way. I also like the early morning because if there are follow-ups, especially quick ones, let me check on that. Let me submit this to Webmaster Tools to expedite crawling. Let me just run another crawl through Screaming Frog to see if the change that you implemented that I just found out about at our meeting was picked up correctly. The early afternoon gives you an opportunity to bookend your day with things to prepare for or to respond to as a result of your meetings.
I like it. Well, either way, a lot of stuff is happening in the early afternoon. But for me, usually the late afternoon, there are fires that have started back at around mid-morning, are usually blazing. And I finally have to deal with them after, getting a few key high impact things out of the way. And usually this is stuff like a website is down, or a client has a really, really urgent question, or there's all kind of loose ends that just come up during the day. Someone sends an email, there's something internal to deal with. And so I usually just assume that the late afternoon is going to be taken up by responding to emails, taking care of questions, formatting and tying off deliverables, tying off editing content, that type of thing.
And I really agree with Nate on this. And I think it's important for people to recognize that the best laid plans will fall apart when life happens. The late afternoon, you are going to have meetings that maybe had to get pushed back slightly. Maybe there was something during your high impact sprint in the morning that you didn't quite finish. The late afternoon is a time for me that is more overflow. We say, all right, let's finish up the things. Let's, as Nate said, put out the fires that had come through, but leave this time open and not try to overly schedule it, because there are going to be things that come up as a result of just the ongoing activities of your day that need to be addressed before close of business. This is where, for me, I like to schedule internal meetings because you have a little bit more flexibility if you need to move those around. You have the flexibility to start a little bit late without, compromising the relationship with your client. I use this time to just respond to one-off questions, these emails that'll take 10, 15 minutes, delegation, reviewing of deliverables. This is a great time to be able to say, I've got almost an open schedule. I'm not trying to put anything concrete on my calendar, but I also recognize that there are going to be priorities that must be addressed before close of business. And this late afternoon time period is a great opportunity to take advantage of that and make sure that you're not having to stay in the office until 8, 9 o'clock at night to get everything done because you scheduled meetings from 1 to 4:30.
Oh, yeah. And I totally agree. I would encourage everyone to get familiar with Parkinson's law, which is a tongue-in-cheek law of business that says that work will expand to fill the time allotted. And keep this in mind when you feel like, you say you're going to go home at 5 and you say, well, really, I don't have to go home until 6, and work will magically fill up that time. But either way, you get home, I go home for dinner, but there are still some things where in the evening, I'm not really, personally, I'm not working, but it's kind of odd because after dinner, after hanging out with family, things that have been mulling happening through the day, sort of, I shifted it to my subconscious, and it's almost like my subconscious started solving it. And so a lot of times during the evening, I'll have like a short 30 minutes, hour where I just have all kind of random ideas, and I have to sit down, write them down, organize it, email it to myself so that I'll deal with it the next day. But it's like the evening is a little bonus experimentation time for me.
Oh, I agree. And I would take it almost in a different approach there, where I use the evenings for triage. I use that to check any of the follow-up emails, plan my, prepare my plan of attack for the next day. What's the frog I'm going to eat in the morning? What am I doing with my high-impact sprint times? What are the absolute must-be-finished by close of business elements that I need to prepare for? I use this time because I agree with Nate, and it's almost the same reason where we talked about taking an actual lunch. Whether or not I sit at my desk every day, but after lunch I go and I bring my dogs to the office every day and I take them for a walk. You get that mental break that allows you to recharge a little bit. Going home, even your commute. A lot of times people will use the commute, come home and say, hey, I had a great idea on the drive, because you give your brain a chance to kind of relax a little bit. And from there, you start to get some great creative ideas that come through. The last thing that I would mention, and this is what, you find what works for each individual person, I tend to avoid checking emails after 8, 9 o'clock. By 8, 9 o'clock, I'm not going to realistically be able to solve the problem before the end of the day. And so to take that time to be able to spend time with family, go to bed at a reasonable hour, read a book for pleasure as opposed to just another marketing article, but to be able to put yourself in a position with that work-life balance so that when you do get up at whatever time that it is, that you have, we said at the very beginning, to have that mental energy fresh at the beginning of the day is what allows, why people always point to the morning as one of the most successful times. But that is also relies on the fact that you have to give yourself a chance to step away. You have to carve out time that isn't for work so that Nate, as he mentioned, Parkinson's law doesn't take over here, and the amount of work you have is going to fill your day. If you give your work 24 hours to fill, it will fill 24 hours of your day. So you have to be able to compartmentalize and be able to say, this is going to be time that I'm going to take a mental break from what I'm doing here. There will be situations where you're crashing on a deadline and you may have to use that time. Those are inevitable, especially if you're in a position like I am where you work more on the agency side. But more often than not, I try to stay away from my email after 8, 9 o'clock so I can use that time to allow myself to recharge and be able to tackle the next day with the same intensity that I did the current day.
I dig it. Well, let's talk about some of the takeaways and tips that we found, whether it be through automation, prioritization, things that clients can do, part-time SEOs can do, in-house SEOs can do. Just quickly run through our long list of tips. And let's start with automation. I love automation.
I know you love automation, and I like pseudo automation, and I say that because I think in the world of SEO, it's very easy to fall into a routine where you feel that you can apply the same template over and over and over again. If you found a structure for a blog post that got a lot of views or a lot of visits, it's very easy to say, well, let's just lather, rinse, repeat, and give the same post with just a different topic. It's very easy to say, I applied this keyword research method to one client. Let me just lather, rinse, repeat, and do it for every other client. Now, the types of keywords that an enterprise software company is going to target are going to be very different than a consumer B2C e-commerce site. You have to make sure that you take automation with a grain of salt and recognize that if you're going to use automation, it should be something that is not subjective to your industry. It's not subjective to the product or service that the business sells, but it's something that provides you with the necessary information for you to execute on your process.
Awesome. So let's talk about some of the specific things that we like to automate. And you'll notice that none of these things have anything to do with strategy. These are more tedious information gathering that computers can do better than humans. So, for example, rankings, pulling just rankings. Please don't manually check Google unless you have a specific need to check Google. Let software do that. Intelligence alerts. So I like this less for automation and more for speed. So if you need to know that your organic traffic has had a severe decrease, let analytics send you a email alert instead of going in and manually checking it. Things like brand and PR alerts. There's some incredible software. Even Google Alerts, if you want to go free and basic, that will crawl the web and send you an email, send you an alert to let you know that, hey, you've been mentioned on this other website. Great thing to automate.
And the one thing that you'll notice about all of those is, again, those are not dictated by your strategy. Your rankings report is going to pull the same regardless of how you are positioning yourself to pursue visibility for that product or service. Now, obviously, the keywords themselves are going to be different, but you are going to pull the rankings report exactly the same for whatever client, whether you're in-house, whether you're agency side, whether you're on the publishing side like Nate. If you run rankings reports, these are exactly the same. Now, these will influence further strategies, absolutely. But actually getting the information, things like your intelligence alerts, things like your brand and PR alerts that Nate mentioned, these are not influenced by strategy, but they do, in fact, influence your ongoing strategy. So the information is absolutely valuable, but you personally pulling and producing those metrics is not something that you should be dedicating your valuable time to.
Oh, yeah. And speaking of valuable time, there's other things where I think it's useful to automate things that will make implementing your strategy more efficient. So it's especially things like email. Tools like Boomerang, followup.cc, Gmail's built-in shortcuts, or writing canned responses within Gmail are all things that you should check out. That there are ways to automate your email, not so that you're turning your email over to a computer, but it's arming yourself with tools that make yourself more efficient. And I think you can extend the same thing to social media. I think it's a really bad idea to fully automate your social media feed, but you can do what Brett said. I like his term of pseudo automation, where you can apply your human strategy and your human judgment to your social media, but then turn it over to a tool to do the actual posting. This is sort of what I've done with my Twitter feed. I'm really, really bad about going in and manually tweeting things. It takes me forever. So instead, what I do, I batch create and handwrite hundreds of tweets all at the same time, and then upload them to Buffer. And then Buffer is the one that actually tweets it all out. But then I'm the one who is manually responding to and retweeting things on Twitter. But either way, it's a tool that will automate your human-led strategy.
And now, even if you don't take Nate's approach, where you're going to say, hey, I got to write 100 of them and queue myself up for the next 30 days. For me, I do a lot of my blog post reading and my kind of just passive research, as we'll call it, meaning I'm not trying to solve a particular problem that I've been presented with in the course of my day, but I just want to make sure that I'm staying on top of trends. I do a lot of this reading late at night, early in the morning. I'll do it on flights, things where it's not the optimal time to be able to share that content. If I read an article, in bed at 10:30 at night and I share that on Twitter, maybe I'll be able to catch people who check it first thing in the morning if nobody else from their stream is posting much later in the night. But for me, I will take that opportunity to automate my social media posting to go during a more optimal time. So I'll say, hey, I know I want to share this. I don't want to share it at 10:30 at night. And I even just use Hootsuite for this. Let me just go in there, write my tweet and say, hey, tweet this tomorrow at 11 a.m. That way, I don't have to, my day tomorrow, I don't have to worry about, oh, crap, did I tweet that article I really liked? Did I send a shout out? Did I follow up with somebody? I'll use Boomerang in a lot of ways to also follow up with people to say, I don't want a response today, but I want this to come to you first thing in the morning. If you're working on, I mentioned outreach emails, where I like to send them, especially for East Coast folks, early in the morning. Get those queued up later in your day, but then use automation to have them sent at the optimal time for the return that you wish to receive. And so using automation, but understanding that it needs to be done very strategically. And again, it needs to be done with an understanding that you should never be automating your entire process, but you should automate modules of it to be able to make you more efficient.
Yeah, and I think that the last thing to mention, rounding out automation, is doing that with reporting. So there's tools, especially for Google Analytics, dashboards, setting up advanced segments. There's plenty of proprietary tools, or even things like syncing your analytics with a Google spreadsheet that will allow you to be much, much faster and take advantage of what computers do well, and that is sorting through data very quickly. And it will arm you with better information at the right time so that you're not going through analytics manually sorting things. So automate your reporting.
No, absolutely. And I think that's something where, regardless of the frequency with which you report, whether you report daily, weekly, monthly, or quarterly, or, as I would not recommend, only once a year, but regardless of the frequency by which you do your reporting, automation is huge, because there is no reason, and with reporting is based on this idea that it's going to be consistent. If I'm sending you different metrics, say we do a weekly report and I report on different things every week, those reports are useless. There is no benefit to a report that doesn't have a logical consistency to it. Now, when you talk about a logical consistency based on data and information, that is a prime opportunity for automation, because you want it to be consistent. You need it to be exactly the same every time. You want the data to update, the actual variables to refresh, but the criteria on which you build your reports should never change. And having automation to be able to consistently report on trends is a huge asset for you, not only in terms of time, but also in terms of resources.
Well, speaking of resources, one thing that we constantly have to do throughout the day is prioritize. There's a million little things that you can always do with SEO that aren't necessarily high impact. So one of the general approach that I take to prioritization is creating imagining a Venn diagram with that has a circle of impact, a circle of time, or how much time it's going to take, and a circle with resources. So whether that's knowledge, expertise, tools, and looking to find out where those three overlap, because it's very easy to say, oh, you should always work on the highest impact item. Well, that's not always true if you don't have the time or the resources to do it. Same goes for time and resources. A lot of time, there are things that take 2 minutes, but they're not very high impact. So I always try to keep in mind with everything that I'm prioritizing is where do those three things overlap?
And the one thing to add to that, and this is something that we do for a number of our different deliverables, but we break things out into tiers. And this allows us to say, a lot of people say, I need to do my keyword research. I need to do keyword research for all 100 pages on my site. There's no way I could possibly send this to a client without having keyword research for all 100 pages. I'm sure everybody's sitting at home listening, knows exactly where I'm going with this, but there's no reason that you have to send all of them over at once. I've made the analogy before where it's like singing a round, where you start the first verse, and then as you finish the first verse, you keep singing, but then somebody else starts the first verse of, and starts singing again. So while you're in the middle of the second verse, somebody's in the middle of the first. When you get to the third verse, somebody's in the middle of the second, somebody's starting the first. So that way you have a constant stream of deliverables that are coming through, that you're erring on the side of action here, where you know that you're getting things implemented. Strategy and research is one of the biggest time sucks and one of the biggest things that everybody talks about prioritizing. They say, how can we possibly build a strategy without doing the research first? But the flip side of that coin is if you're spending all your time doing research, you have never actually implemented anything on the website. When you don't implement anything on the website, Google and Yahoo and Bing and other search engines can't process your changes. And in reality, you have not optimized for search engines. You have simply done the research to identify things that you might potentially optimize. So we want to make sure that as we're doing this, you can break things out into tiers. You can break them out into what is going to give us the opportunity to implement immediately. Make sure that it's not compromising the quality of the work, but do enough so that we can take this to the implementation stage. That should be the goal here. When you're prioritizing, you should be able to see what is the time from research to implementation, and how can we break this up into smaller tiers so that we can shorten the time from research to implementation.
Keep the pipeline full of things that you can actually implement, and removing roadblocks for every deliverable that's moving towards actually being implemented so that you can get feedback on it. We actually did a whole episode on that, episode 1, if you want to check it out.
We did. That was the very first one. We want to say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think was the one big takeaway from that is you have to be implementing things. You have to, and I said it before, I'm going to repeat it again here. You have to err on the side of action. Because if we are not making any changes to our websites, we have effectively done nothing. As SEOs, we have done nothing until we effect change on the website that search engines can view as an improvement in our domain authority. That should be the goal. And we're reading a book right now here at Knucklepug called Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. Fantastic book. Absolutely recommend it to anybody.
It's a very good book.
And it has, in one of the early chapters, they talk about this concept of a commander's intent. And they say, if you have multiple priorities, then you don't have any priorities. There needs to be one concise and compact theory that drives every action that you are going to take. And now, if that is going to be our commander's intent as SEOs, is we need to implement changes to optimize performance of the website. And it is predicated, again, on that action of implementing change, because search engines do not see anything from our research. They only see from what is affected on the website itself.
Yeah, and speaking of things that stop action and are more talk, I think a running theme that Brett, you brought up earlier is meetings, and not having a clear direction of meetings, so that they become sort of just talking shops instead of places to figure out the right thing to implement as soon as possible.
Yeah, and meetings, honestly, there are ways that you can run meetings effectively, and there are ways that you can run meetings supremely ineffectively. Meetings should not be times to give summaries of work that was done. You can do that in email. Meetings should not involve more people that wouldn't actively participate in the meeting. We've been in meetings where Nate and I have been in meetings together where there are 20 people in the room. 18 of them never open their mouth. that is not an effective use of time with regards to your meetings. You want to make sure that you have a clear agenda, that you have a commander's intent for that meeting. What are we looking to accomplish here? You make sure that all parties involved have had ample time to review any deliverables that you're going to discuss, and you make sure that the meeting is going to drive action. There should be, in every one of our client meetings, we send a recap afterwards, and there's a section where we talk about upcoming action items. We should have, every meeting should result in, this is what I do next that I would not have known had we not sat down for that meeting. The other thing that I would add for as far as meetings is they need to be collaborative. I gave the reference before where the 20-person meeting where 18 people take notes. You don't need that. You need one person to take notes and 18 people to be CC'd on that email. Recognize how much time that it takes. Even a 10-minute meeting with 20 people in it is almost 3.5 hours of time. You have to make sure that you understand that the aggregate time spent in meetings is time taken away from things that can actually affect change. So you want to make sure that meetings are collaborative. You want to make sure that they are not driven by one or a small handful of individuals, that every person involved in the meeting has an active role in participating in that meeting, and that at the end of it, everybody should have a clear understanding of their personal action items, but also the overall organizational goals that those action items are intended to accomplish. Now, a lot of times, especially as SEOs, we stay really focused on what is it that we can accomplish? What is it that we need to do with the day? What kind of deliverables do we need to produce? But we also have to have an understanding of who are the other people that we need to work with to get these things implemented. I'm going to come at it from an agency perspective, but anybody that does work has your own definition of your clients. These are the people that you rely on to be able to accomplish the strategies outlined by the SEO team. Now, if it's in-house, your clients might be your in-house development team. It might be your content team or your creatives. If you're agency, obviously clients are the clients themselves, but they may also be third-party development firms that you have to work with. Understanding, exactly what your clients are expecting from you is essential to being able to manage your schedule and manage your time in a way that is going to be most efficient. Clients should understand exactly what they're paying for and exactly what initiatives that payment is going to support. The agency, on the other hand, and again, I use agency broadly to refer to the SEO folks and the clients to refer to the complementary team members. But the agency should be able to communicate what they have done and the impact that it has on the business objectives. We're not talking about just stating, hey, I sent you keyword research. We're talking about, I sent you keyword research. I need feedback on two primary things. I need to understand if there are any keywords that I'm suggesting that you feel are not a good fit, and I need to know if there's any keywords I did not suggest that you would like me to look into. People have clear action items. The client and the agency, given our analogy here, both understand what is expected of them, and they both understand why. We need this feedback because we are going to start optimizing the on-page elements with a consistent and consolidated keyword theme based on this research. Because this lays the foundation for everything else we're going to do from an on-page perspective, it is essential that we are all on the same page here. This gives us the opportunity as SEOs to be able to generate buy-in. It gives us the opportunity to be able to preempt that discussion of what is this going to do for me or why are we doing this? We need to be able to communicate exactly what it is that we are doing. And that is a key part of the day in the life of an SEO because we are still working in a black box industry, so to speak, where a lot of people don't understand what it is that we do and why we are recommending the strategies that we are. So this idea of education, both self-education and also educating the team members that you work with, it leads to better conversations. It leads to a more effective working relationship with all the moving parts, and it ensures that the time and the research that you're doing does, as we mentioned before, affect change and action with regards to the website itself.
Well, one of our previous episodes with Jess Hill, she was giving her perspective being an in-house SEO coming from the agency world. And she called out that one of the big benefits of having been an SEO is that she knew all the terminology. She knew the jargon. She knew what mattered. And so when she got to hire an agency, she was able to skip directly to what's the strategy? What are we going to do? How are you going to do it? Instead of spending, the first few months basically paying for a very, very expensive education lesson in SEO. And again, this isn't complicated stuff. This is stuff that you can go to Google Webmaster Tools and just read through their sections in a few hours. And it allows you to not only jump farther up in the value chain of it with your SEO team, but it also allows you to keep your SEO team honest and not allow them to hide behind all the jargon and whatnot, and force them to skip to the things that are going to really matter. Which I think that will circle back to one of the other things that clients can take away, and that is being very clear with what you need from your SEO. And this is especially relevant to directors of marketing who have bosses above them. So if you need ammunition to sell a strategy to your CEO, make that clear. Make it clear what are the metrics that you are being looked at within your company. You know, if people look at rankings, even if rankings don't matter or rankings need to be looked at through a certain lens or with a certain nuance, if they're being looked at, your SEO needs to know that. Your SEO they need to know what are your other initiatives that you need SEO to supplement, or vice versa. And you just need to be very clear about what do you need from your SEO.
And to that point, kind of as a natural extension there, you need to give control to your SEO to match the responsibility and the expectations that you have. You know, it's one of those things where knuckle puck is a core aspect to the way we do SEO. Actually has nothing to do with SEO. It has to do with our project management. It has to do with how we educate clients and maintain a positive working relationship, because we are all in the same team. You know, we pride ourselves on being an extension of our clients' teams. And that is built on this idea of trust, that the control they're going to give us and what they believe, you know, what they entrust us to do with regards to their website, that we have a responsibility to honor that. We have a responsibility to educate our clients in terms of the right questions to be asking, but also, as Nate mentioned, if they are getting questions, we also have an obligation to respond to questions that are coming from other folks within the organization. You know, you have to have a positive working relationship between SEO agency and client. Again, that can be defined in any number of ways, but there has to be a positive working relationship that goes beyond simply doing the SEO work, because that is what's going to allow us to get things implemented. It's what's going to allow us to push things up the ladder and get in front of the people who maybe need to provide approval and know what they're approving. You know, we have to give the control to match responsibility for the SEO, and you have to make sure that at all costs that you are maintaining that positive relationship, because in the absence of a positive working relationship, it's impossible for the entire mechanism to work efficiently. There are so many moving parts that if there are parts that are at odds or in conflict with one another, the entire mechanism shuts down. So as you know, what clients can take away from this is recognize that your SEO has a responsibility to you, but you also have a responsibility to your SEO to make sure that everybody is getting the tools and the resources that they need to effectively execute on the strategies that you have mutually agreed are in the best interest of your organization.
One thing about SEO is that even within agencies or in-house is that it's very rarely on its own. Or even if it is in its own department, it's part of a larger organization. You have to work with managers. You have to work with a PR team, a PPC team. You have to work with a development team. And so let's talk about what can managers take away with helping their SEO team work better. I would start off and go ahead and say that communication of the end goal is essential. So just because a manager or another team member has seen an SEO deliverable, the next SEO deliverable won't necessarily look the same. And that's because not every client or even not every strategy can fit perfectly in the same template.
And I think that leads to an important distinction that we need to make here. And we even alluded to this in the opening of this episode. But there is a very real difference between process and template. A template is something that you simply apply to the same project over and over and over again. Your reporting template, for example, if we have an e-commerce reporting template, we know that we want to look at traffic. We want to look at conversions. Specifically, we want to look at e-commerce transactions and revenue. We have a template that can be applied to every single one of our e-commerce clients to give us at least a general overview of the results that we are producing. Now, process can almost be viewed as a collection of different modules or a collection of constantly evolving templates. Where your process, you know that you have certain pieces. You know that keyword research is going to be important. You know a strong technical foundation is important. You understand that links from external sources still have a high impact on organic ranking in search engines. The process needs to be built around these core criteria. But the way that we actually go about executing on the process needs to be fluid, and it needs to adapt specifically to the industry. It needs to adapt specifically to the goals or the product or service that you're trying to sell and the community or the audience that you're selling it to. So when we talk about template is almost a set of steps that we are going to take every single time. Now, the process is like a dance. If you're going to say there may be different steps, you may kind of audible and throw in some flourishes and some spins here and there. You can't go into it expecting to follow the same 25 steps in a row and have a perfect dance. You have to be able to balance this idea of using these modules, using these small templates, but mixing and matching them in a way that allows you to adapt and to iterate to how the search engines respond to your strategies, so that you're always focusing again on those end goals rather than just saying, well, this isn't working. Clearly, traffic is actually down in the first 3 months, but let's just keep soldiering on. We know this process worked for X, Y, and Z client. Why wouldn't it work for ABC client? You have to have the ability to adapt, and you have to have the understanding that sooner or later you will have to abandon your template. That if you expect as an SEO that you are going to be able to do the same thing over and over again and never change, or if you expect as a manager that your team is going to be able to follow this same template without wavering, you are going to find that sooner or later there are negative consequences to this approach, because not Google will change, so your process needs to evolve. Clients and industries are different. Competitiveness within industries are different. The actual ranking signals and the ways that they're weighted are all different. So your process needs to be very, very fluid, but it needs to incorporate a constantly adapting series of templates that are all focused on that end goal of connecting businesses with their consumers.
I think you mentioned evolving, and actually, I think the theory of evolution, the process of evolution in nature, is actually a perfect analogy for this. I mean, you look at how shared ancestors will evolve in different environments, and you'll end up with completely different species. And even though they technically have the same shared ancestor, and so it's like the template just allows you to get started, and the process allows you to save time. But the point is to have innovation on top of that, so that you can actually create things that will work for this client in this time, in this space.
And I think what also is interesting about that is, in nature, different species and different creatures are going to be faced with different circumstances. You need to adapt to those circumstances. And if you don't do that, then you're putting yourself in a negative position right from the get-go.
Let's talk about people who are doing SEOs part-time. So whether it's marketing directors who, they don't have an agency or they don't have an in-house SEO, but they still are in charge of growing organic traffic as part of total website traffic.
Sure. And when we talk about, again, this may be somebody who's doing freelance work on the side. This may be, again, somebody who wears multiple hats, and SEO is just one of them. And the biggest thing that we want to do, a day in your life is not going to look like ours, because you have a number of other high impact items that you need to address. You're not sitting here and being able to say, all right, well, I'm going to eat the frog and do my keyword research early in the day. Then I'm going to check my Google Analytics segments. Then I'm going to go in and do some research for a technical audit, have my lunch, go through and finalize kind of a content optimization spreadsheet. And then in my afternoon, I'm going to put out the fires in terms of making sure that we're implementing the technical items. Your day may look like, all right, well, I have an hour to do SEO. What am I going to do with it? Because the other 7 hours are already booked. And so the first thing that we want to do, and really which runs through our recommendations for anybody in this role, is that you have to break down into component parts, and you have to compartmentalize your time based on the highest, that Venn diagram that Nate referenced between resources, time, and impact.
Yeah, and so within that Venn diagram, I mean, if you're using that Venn diagram to look at all of your responsibilities, one great thing about SEO is how it complements and integrates with so many other marketing processes. I mean, if you are building out a lot of times we look at content, but I mean, if you're looking at a local sponsorship campaign, a lot of times you can integrate SEO into that and think, oh, well, this might be a great way to build links or to get content ideas. Maybe you're interviewing some of the people that you're sponsoring. Or, if you're doing outreach for PR, that's going to align directly with SEO. And so it's sort of a process of compartmentalizing SEO when it comes to working on SEO and looking at where are you going to have the highest impact, but also considering SEO as one part of a greater whole and deciding on what's going to have the highest impact for everything that you're doing, and then seeing where the highest impact part of SEO that's going to be able to fit into what you're already doing.
And so to kind of wrap that up, I actually want to throw a little bit of a twist into our recommendations here. And that talks about, the idea of a part-time SEO, the marketing manager, the freelancer, what have you, is that you wear a lot of hats. What goes along with that is there has to be a compromise between these different complementary mediums and the priorities that you have been presented with. But when you are focused on the SEO, you need to be focused on the SEO exclusively. There was a great post that Jason Cohen wrote up, which we'll link to in the show notes, based on a conversation he had with Noah Kagan, who I know we've referenced a few times on the podcast, where he talks about this idea that you have to have that one metric that you're focused on, and then you need to ignore everything else. And it's a fantastic post, and it talks about being able to eliminate the noise, eliminate all the excuses for why you're not doing the strategy that's going to drive SEO growth. But you need to, at least even if you just do it for that 1 hour a day you have dedicated to SEO, your mind needs to be fully dedicated, because you're in a position where you have to argue both for SEO, but also for some of these other marketing channels that are going to compete for these finite time and resources. Now, ultimately, you are the person that decides how those resources are allocated. But essentially, what this post that Jason wrote talks about is it talks about this idea of recognizing what is going to be that one thing that is going to allow you to be successful against your goals. You need to ignore everything else. Anything that you say, well, we don't have the budget for this. I'm like, well, then you need to be able to find the budget. And then it puts you in a position where you have to, if nothing else, go through the mental exercise of positioning your SEO goals against everything else and recognizing, here's the impact that I expect. You have to objectively analyze whether or not the impact of this strategy is going to be greater than, less than, or equal to the impact of another one. Nate talked about it, just a couple minutes ago, but this idea of identifying and evaluating impact is really the turning point for a good SEO, whether you're a part-time, whether you are a full-time agency, whether you are in-house on the client side. Understanding and evaluating impact and then being able to allocate your time and resources accordingly is the primary function of an SEO, and that's the commander's intent that we're talking about in the day of a life in an SEO, is you have to be able to adequately associate impact with the actions that you want to take to drive that impact.
All right. Well, you can find previous episodes, links to all the things that we mentioned, and our contact information at bamboochalupa.com. If you don't want to miss another episode, go subscribe to the podcast in iTunes or your favorite podcast app, and do leave a comment and rating while you're there. We learn a lot from your feedback, and your ratings helps others to discover the show. So for Brett Snyder, I'm Nate Shiver. Thank you for listening.